I'm 70 years old now, and if life has taught me anything, it's this. The deepest wounds rarely come from strangers. They come from the people whose names are written inside your family Bible. If you've ever sat at a holiday table wondering when your place quietly disappeared, then perhaps you'll understand why I still remember every second of that Christmas Eve. It wasn't the snow. It wasn't the music. It wasn't even the whisper itself. It was the smile on my son's face while he said it. Sometimes, betrayal doesn't arrive wearing anger. Sometimes, it comes with open arms. Christmas had always been sacred to me. Not because of expensive gifts. Not because of sparkling decorations. Because it was the one day every year when I believed families remembered who they truly were. For almost 4 decades, my late husband, Thomas, and I welcomed everyone into our small home outside Indianapolis. Our dining room barely fit 10 people. We somehow squeezed in 16. Children sat on folding chairs. Teenagers argued over who got the last dinner roll. Someone always forgot the cranberry sauce until the turkey was already carved. Thomas used to wink at me every year and say, "If everything goes according to plan, it isn't really Christmas." I would laugh. Back then, I believed we would grow old making those same memories forever. Life had other plans. Thomas passed away 7 years ago. The kindest man I ever knew left this world on a quiet February morning, holding my hand until the very end. People often say time heals grief. I don't think that's true. Time simply teaches you how to carry it without letting everyone see how heavy it still feels. For months after the funeral, I caught myself listening for his footsteps every evening. I'd make 2 cups of coffee before remembering there was only one of us left. His favorite cardigan stayed hanging by the hallway closet long after winter had passed. I couldn't bring myself to move it. Some absences become part of the furniture. Our only son, Daniel, stepped into that empty space the best he could. "Mom," he told me one spring afternoon, "you've taken care of everyone else your whole life. Let me take care of you now." Those words meant everything to me, because I'd spent my entire adult life making sure he never had to choose between his dreams and our bills. Thomas worked overtime whenever he could. I took extra shifts at the public library. There were years when vacations meant driving to the county park because hotels simply weren't possible. I wore the same winter coat for nearly 12 years. Not because I loved it, because Daniel needed braces. Later, he needed college tuition. Then seed money for a business he believed could change his future. We never called those sacrifices. We called them parenting, and we never regretted them. Not once. Years later, that young man built a technology company worth more money than Thomas and I had earned in our entire lives combined. Every local business magazine seemed eager to feature him. People admired his intelligence, his generosity, his leadership. Whenever someone learned I was Daniel's mother, they smiled with genuine admiration. "You must be so proud." I always answered honestly. I couldn't be prouder, because I truly believed success hadn't changed the boy I raised. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. After Thomas died, Daniel insisted Christmas should be celebrated at his house. "It'll be easier for everyone," he explained. "You shouldn't have to cook for 30 people anymore." He wasn't wrong. My knees weren't what they used to be. Standing over a stove for 12 hours had become harder each year. So I agreed. His home was breathtaking. A modern estate overlooking a small lake, wrapped in floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected fresh December snow like polished mirrors. Everything inside looked as though it belonged in a magazine. Towering Christmas trees decorated by professional designers. Fresh, evergreen garlands draped over custom-built fireplaces. Crystal ornaments that probably cost more than my first car. The kitchen was larger than the entire first floor of the house where Daniel had grown up. Beautiful, elegant, impressive. Yet somehow, it never smelled like Christmas. No cinnamon, no roasting turkey, no cookies cooling on old wire racks. Everything came perfectly prepared by caterers. Nothing was burned. Nothing was out of place. Nothing felt lived in. I reminded myself that every generation celebrates differently. There was nothing wrong with that. Or so I thought. I still brought dessert. Apple pie. Pecan pie. The same recipes my mother taught me when I was barely older than my granddaughter. Emily, my daughter-in-law, greeted me with a warm embrace. "Martha, you really didn't have to do this." I know, I smiled. But I wanted the grandchildren to taste a little tradition. She laughed softly. "They always love your pies." Emily had impeccable manners. She remembered birthdays. She sent thank you cards. She never raised her voice. If you met her for only an hour, you'd probably think she was the perfect daughter-in-law. Perhaps that's why it took me so long to notice the things she never said, or the conversations that suddenly stopped whenever I entered a room. Small things, easy to dismiss. At the time, I dismissed them all. My grandchildren saved me from overthinking. Grandma, 8-year-old Lily wrapped herself around my waist before I'd even taken my coat off. Her younger brother, Noah, proudly showed me the wooden train he'd built with his father. Children don't care about wealth. They care about attention. I knelt beside them, ignoring the ache in my knees, listening as though their stories were the most important news in the world. For a few precious minutes, they were. Guests continued arriving. Business partners, neighbors, friends from the country club. Everyone admired Daniel's success. I overheard compliments everywhere. You've built an incredible life. Your family is beautiful. You're living the American dream. Daniel accepted every compliment with effortless confidence. Watching him, I couldn't help remembering the little boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder after Sunday church. The years had changed almost everything about him. Almost. When our eyes met across the room, he smiled. The same crooked smile he'd had since childhood. He walked toward me carrying 2 glasses of sparkling cider. Having a good time, Mom? I am. He handed me one of the glasses before pulling me into a hug. It felt natural, comforting, familiar. For just a heartbeat, I closed my eyes. Then I felt his lips move close to my ear. His voice dropped into a whisper so soft no one else could hear. Enjoying the $5,000 a month, Mom? My heart skipped once. Only once. Years teach you that surprise is easier to hide than pain. So I smiled. The exact same smile everyone else saw. I suppose I am, I answered quietly. He squeezed my shoulder. Good. Nothing more. He stepped away and immediately greeted another guest, laughing as though he'd said something harmless. Around us, Christmas carried on. Children chased each other through the hallway. Someone began singing along with the piano. Wine glasses clinked. Camera flashes lit the room. No one noticed the silence growing inside me. $5,000. The number echoed through my thoughts. Not because I needed the money. Not because I didn't recognize it. But because of the way Daniel had said my. Or perhaps, the way he'd silently implied it belonged to him. Standing beside a 12-foot Christmas tree covered in thousands of white lights, I suddenly felt colder than I had outside in the December snow. And for the first time in my son's entire life, I wondered whether I truly knew the man he had become. That whisper lasted less than 5 seconds. The truth hidden behind it would unravel everything I thought I understood about my family. The whisper stayed with me long after the music drowned it out. $5,000. It wasn't the amount that bothered me. Daniel knew better than anyone that I had never measured love in dollars. When he was 10 years old, he wanted a new baseball glove that cost almost a week's worth of groceries. I couldn't afford both. So I patched his old glove one more time and spent 3 evenings hemming dresses for neighbors to earn the difference. He never knew. Children aren't supposed to know those things. Parents simply make them happen. Standing in his living room that Christmas Eve, I found myself wondering when money had become the language he chose to speak to me. I took a slow sip of sparkling cider. It had gone flat. Around me, conversations floated through the room like warm air from the fireplace. Someone complimented the decorations. Someone admired the view of the frozen lake. A group of Daniel's business friends laughed about ski trips in Colorado. Life continued exactly as it should. Only mine had quietly shifted. I told myself not to overreact. Perhaps I'd misunderstood. Perhaps he was making an awkward joke. Age teaches you something important. Not every uncomfortable moment deserves an immediate confrontation. Sometimes silence gives the truth enough room to reveal itself. Thomas believed that. Whenever someone accused a neighbor of gossip or dishonesty, he'd smile and say, "Give people enough time. They always introduce themselves." I missed that steady wisdom. More than ever, Emily appeared beside me carrying a tray of appetizers. "Martha, are you all right?" I was just admiring the tree. She smiled. "It took 3 designers almost 2 days to finish it." "It certainly shows." She looked pleased. Emily appreciated beautiful things. Fresh flowers delivered every Friday. Perfectly folded linen napkins. Candles arranged by season. Everything in her home had its place. Everything except, perhaps, genuine messiness. Our old Christmases had been noisy. Children spilled punch on the carpet. Dogs begged beneath the table. Someone inevitably dropped a serving spoon. Those moments used to embarrass me. Now I miss them. Perfect homes can sometimes hide imperfect hearts. Lily tugged gently on my sleeve. Grandma, come see the train. She led me into the family room where a model railroad circled a tiny Christmas village beneath another enormous tree. Snow-covered houses, miniature street lamps, tiny painted families carrying gifts. Noah proudly pressed a button. The little train came alive. I built most of it with Dad. You did a wonderful job. His face lit up. Children don't need expensive praise. They only need to know someone truly sees them. I watched the tiny train make another lap around the village. Round and round, always returning to where it began. Families often do the same. They repeat patterns without realizing it. Good ones, bad ones, sometimes both. Dinner was announced shortly afterward. The dining table seemed to stretch. Forever. Crystal glasses, gold-rimmed china, fresh evergreen running down the center beside hundreds of tiny white lights. Every place card had been printed in elegant calligraphy. Emily thought of every detail. I noticed my seat was near the end of the table, not beside Daniel, not beside the grandchildren. Farther down, next to two guests I'd never met. It wasn't offensive. Not really. Families grow. Seating changes. Still, I remembered the years when Daniel refused to begin Christmas dinner unless I sat beside his father. Funny how memories sneak into ordinary moments. Across the table, Daniel stood to welcome everyone. He thanked friends for coming. He praised Emily for organizing another beautiful Christmas celebration. He spoke about gratitude, about family, about how fortunate everyone was to be together. People applauded. I did too. He looked every bit the successful son any mother would celebrate. If someone had filmed only those 5 minutes, they would have believed our family was perfect. Perhaps that's what appearances are for, to make difficult truths easier to overlook. As dinner continued, I listened more than I spoke. Years ago, I had always been at the center of conversation. People asked for recipes, advice, stories about Daniel as a little boy. Now the conversations revolved around investment opportunities, vacation homes, stock markets, and new technology. I recognized very little of that world. That didn't bother me. Every generation builds its own language. But I noticed something else. Whenever anyone mentioned generosity, Daniel casually laughed. My mom refuses to let me do too much for her. A few guests smiled. You're a good son. You really take care of your mother. Daniel shrugged modestly. I do what I can. I felt several people glance toward me with warm approval. I smiled politely. Inside, another small piece of the puzzle shifted. No one asked me a single question. No one asked whether his statement was true. Why would they? They trusted what they saw. A successful son. An elderly mother. A simple story. Simple stories are comforting. Real ones rarely are. Later that evening, I stepped onto the back patio for a little fresh air. Snowflakes drifted across the lake, settling silently on the wooden railing. The cold cleared my thoughts. I reached into my purse for my phone, intending to check the time. Instead, my eyes lingered on a banking app one rarely opened. The monthly deposits Daniel had mentioned flashed through my mind. $5,000. For years, I'd accepted those deposits without thinking much about them. I had assumed they were simply part of the financial arrangements he'd insisted on after Thomas died. I trusted my son. Trust doesn't ask many questions. Perhaps it should. I closed the phone without opening the app. Not because I was afraid of what I might find. Because I knew one thing with absolute certainty. When I returned home after Christmas, I was going to look at every statement, every transfer, every document. For the first time in years, I wasn't searching for reassurance. I was searching for the truth. And something deep inside me whispered that the truth had been waiting much longer than I realized. I didn't mention the whisper to anyone that night. Not to Emily. Not to the grandchildren. Certainly not to Daniel. Some questions deserve an immediate answer. Others require patience. At 70, I'd learned the difference. The drive home took a little over an hour. Snow continued falling, soft enough that it blurred the edges of the road. Christmas lights glowed from front porches and rooftops, each house looking warm from the outside. I wondered how many families behind those windows were carrying burdens no one else could see. Mine had looked perfect too. For years. When I pulled into my driveway, the house greeted me with the same quiet it always had. No laughter. No television. No footsteps. Just silence. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. placing my coat over the old wooden chair Thomas had built nearly 30 years earlier. The living room was exactly as I'd left it. A modest Christmas tree stood in the corner beside the fireplace. Most of the ornaments weren't expensive. They didn't need to be. There was the little paper angel Daniel made in second grade, the clay snowman that had lost one button sometime in the late 90s. A faded ornament with our family picture tucked inside. Every decoration held a memory. None of them had ever cared how much money we had. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea. It had become a nightly habit after Thomas passed away. People often ask whether routines help with grief. They do. Not because they erase loneliness, because they remind you that tomorrow still deserves to arrive. I carried the warm mug into the den where our old oak desk still sat beneath the window. Thomas had balanced our checkbook there every Sunday afternoon. He believed numbers told stories. If something doesn't make sense, he'd often say while adjusting his reading glasses, "Follow the paperwork." At the time, I thought he was talking about finances. Years later, I realized he was talking about life. I turned on the small desk lamp. Its yellow light filled only part of the room, leaving the corners wrapped in gentle shadow. Outside, snow continued drifting across the yard. Inside, I opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. Everything was organized exactly the way Thomas had taught me. Insurance, taxes, property records, medical files, bank statements. I smiled to myself. Daniel used to tease us. "You two still keep paper copies of everything?" Thomas would grin. "Computers fail. Paper waits." I suddenly found myself grateful for every folder we'd kept. The bank statements were stacked neatly by month. I wasn't looking for anything specific. At least, that's what I told myself. I simply wanted to understand what Daniel had meant. Nothing more. I flipped through the most recent statement. There it was. Electronic deposit. $5,000. The same amount. The same date. Every month. It had become so routine that I'd stopped paying attention. The deposits arrived. I paid my utilities. Bought groceries. Made donations to church. Helped the grandchildren on birthdays. Life continued. I had never questioned where the money actually came from, because I trusted the person sending it. Trust can make intelligent people overlook obvious questions. I opened another statement. Then another. Same amount. Same schedule. Always on time. Always electronically transferred. I leaned back in my chair. Something felt off. Not wrong. Just incomplete. Daniel's whisper echoed through my mind. "Enjoying the $5,000 a month, Mom?" He hadn't asked whether I needed it. He hadn't asked whether it helped. He'd asked whether I was enjoying it. The wording bothered me more than I wanted to admit, almost as though the money represented something much larger. I reached for my laptop. The online banking portal offered more details than the paper statements. After entering my password, I opened the transfer history. A long list appeared. Month after month. Year after year. Each deposit carried nearly identical information. Automatic transfer. Reference number. Processing code. Nothing unusual. Until I noticed something that made me stop. The sender's name wasn't Daniel's personal account. It wasn't even listed under his company. Instead, every transfer came from an account with a name I didn't immediately recognize. Hawthorne Family Holdings. I frowned. Hawthorne. That had been Thomas's mother's maiden name. Years ago, our accountant suggested using it when creating a small family trust after Daniel graduated from college. I hadn't thought about that trust in years. Hadn't needed to. Thomas handled most of those conversations. After he died, Daniel assured me everything had already been arranged. "Mom, don't worry about paperwork," he'd said. "I'll make sure everything keeps running smoothly." I believed him. Without hesitation, I clicked on the account details. Access denied. My permission level didn't allow me to view additional information. That surprised me. If the money supporting me came from that trust, why couldn't I see it? Perhaps there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Perhaps Daniel had simply updated the account after taking over our financial affairs. Still, another small question quietly settled beside the first. Questions have a habit of multiplying. I closed the laptop and rubbed my eyes. It was well after midnight. The house had grown colder. The tea beside me had gone untouched. I wasn't frightened. Not yet. Mostly, I felt unsettled. Like finishing a familiar book only to discover several pages had been replaced without your knowledge. The story still looked the same, but somehow, it no longer made sense. The next morning, Christmas Day, I attended church as I always did. The sanctuary was filled with familiar faces. Children sang softly. Candles glowed along the windows. Pastor Miller spoke about hope, about forgiveness, about truth eventually finding the light. Normally, those words brought comfort. This time, they lingered differently. Truth. I kept returning to that word. After the service, several friends greeted me. How was Christmas with Daniel? Oh, wonderful, I answered with an easy smile. He hosted everyone beautifully. That wasn't a lie. He had. The decorations were beautiful. The dinner was flawless. The guests left impressed. None of them had heard the whisper. Neither had anyone else. Sometimes a family doesn't fall apart during the loud moments. Sometimes it begins with a sentence spoken so quietly that only one heart hears it. And before the week was over, another unexpected discovery would convince me that the whisper had never been about $5,000 at all. The days after Christmas have always felt different to me. The excitement fades. The wrapping paper disappears. The house grows quiet again. For most people, that's the end of the holiday. For me, it became the beginning of a question I could no longer ignore. Every time I walked past the oak desk in my den, I found myself thinking about the same thing. Hawthorne Family Holdings. The name refused to leave my mind. Thomas hadn't liked complicated finances. If you can't explain it over a cup of coffee, he used to say, it's probably more complicated than it needs to be. We built our lives on simple things. A checking account, a savings account, a mortgage that took 23 years to pay off. Nothing glamorous, nothing hidden. So why had our family trust suddenly become something I couldn't even look into? The Monday after Christmas, I made myself breakfast earlier than usual. 2 slices of toast, 1 boiled egg, black coffee, the same breakfast I'd eaten for nearly 20 years. Routine has a calming effect, especially when your thoughts refuse to settle. After washing the dishes, I returned to my computer. This time, I wasn't simply curious. I wanted facts. I opened every bank statement I could access. Then I created a small notebook beside my keyboard. Thomas always wrote things down. I decided I would too. 1 page, 1 question at a time. No assumptions, no accusations, just facts. The deposits stretched back farther than I expected. Month after month, year after year, always exactly $5,000. Never $4,900. Never $5,100. Always the exact same amount. Automatic. Predictable. Almost mechanical. People often mistake consistency for honesty. Sometimes consistency simply means someone has perfected a routine. I circled the first deposit date. Then another. Then another. A pattern slowly appeared. The payments hadn't begun after Thomas passed away. They had started nearly 6 months earlier. That stopped me. I leaned back in my chair. Thomas was still alive then. Very sick, but alive. If Daniel had truly decided to support me after my husband's death, why had the transfers begun before that? I opened an old calendar stored inside my filing cabinet. I have always kept calendars. Birthdays, doctor appointments, church events, notes scribbled in the margins. Life leaves small footprints on paper. I turned back to the month when the first transfer appeared. 3 days before it. A short note written in my own handwriting. Meeting with Attorney Collins. I stared at the words for several seconds. I remembered the meeting. Or at least, part of it. Thomas had insisted we update our estate documents while he was still strong enough to participate. Daniel attended. So did Attorney Collins. The conversation had lasted nearly 2 hours. Mostly legal language I barely understood. At the end, Thomas squeezed my hand beneath the conference table. We're just making things easier later. I trusted him. I signed where they asked me to sign. I never thought about it again. Until now. I picked up my phone. Attorney Collins had retired several years earlier. I remembered receiving a Christmas card announcing it. His practice had been taken over by another attorney. Margaret Ellis. The name sounded familiar. I searched through an old address book. There it was. Ellis and Harper Law. The office was still listed. My finger hovered over the phone for a moment. Then I set it back down. No, not yet. I still didn't know enough to ask the right questions. Thomas always believed preparation mattered. Never walk into a meeting hoping someone else will explain your own life to you. I could almost hear his voice. Instead, I opened another folder. Tax returns. Everything appeared normal. Property taxes paid. Insurance current. Investment income. Social Security. Pension. Nothing unusual. Then I noticed something small. Very small. The trust distributions were listed, but they weren't described as gifts from Daniel. They were recorded as scheduled beneficiary distributions. I read the phrase 3 times. Beneficiary, not recipient of financial support. Beneficiary. There is a difference. One suggests generosity. The other suggests ownership. A legal right. I suddenly understood why Daniel's whisper had unsettled me. Everyone around us probably believed he was sending me $5,000 every month from his own fortune. Even I had quietly accepted that assumption. But the paperwork wasn't saying that. The paperwork suggested something else entirely. That afternoon, I drove to my bank. Not because I expected the teller to solve anything. Sometimes speaking to a real person helps organize your own thoughts. The branch manager, Susan, recognized me immediately. "Martha, it's good to see you." "You too." She invited me into her office. The room overlooked the parking lot where fresh snow still covered the sidewalks. "I have a question," I said. "It may have a very simple answer." She smiled. "Those are usually the best kind." I handed her one of my statements. "I'm trying to understand these monthly transfers." She adjusted her glasses and studied the document. After a minute, she looked back at me. "I can explain the banking side." "I'd appreciate that." "The transfers are automated." I figured. "They've been authorized through a trust account." I noticed. She nodded. "The bank simply processes the instructions we've been given." "Who gives those instructions?" "I'm afraid I can't tell you that." "Why not?" "Because the account isn't under your authorization level." I thanked her anyway. She hadn't answered my biggest question, but she had confirmed something important. The bank wasn't treating Daniel like someone sending money to his mother. It was treating someone as the administrator of a trust. Those aren't the same thing. Not at all. Driving home, I kept replaying the conversation. Snowflakes landed softly against the windshield. Traffic moved slowly. For the first time since Christmas Eve, I stopped wondering whether I had misunderstood my son's whisper. I hadn't. He had chosen every word carefully. "Enjoying $5,000 a month, Mom?" He hadn't been reminding me that he loved me. He had been reminding me that he believed he controlled something. Or perhaps, that he believed I would never question it. He had underestimated one thing. Growing older had not made me weaker. It had made me patient. And patient people notice details others overlook. When I pulled into my driveway, I looked at the business card I'd written on a small notepad earlier that morning. Margaret Ellis, attorney, successor to Thomas's longtime lawyer. I slipped the card into my purse. Tomorrow, I would make the call. And although I didn't know it yet, that single phone conversation would uncover the first piece of a truth my son had spent years assuming I would never find. The next morning, I called the law office just after 9. I almost hung up before anyone answered. Not because I was afraid, because part of me still hoped there was a simple explanation waiting on the other end of the line. Perhaps a clerical error. Perhaps an outdated document. Perhaps nothing at all. Hope has a quiet way of protecting us from truths we're not ready to face. A cheerful receptionist answered. "Ellis and Harper Law. How may I help you?" "My name is Martha Bennett," I said. "Several years ago, my husband and I worked with attorney James Collins. I was hoping to speak with whoever took over his estate planning files." There was a brief pause as I heard a keyboard clicking. "Mrs. Bennett, attorney Margaret Ellis inherited Mr. Collins' client records after his retirement. Let me see if she's available." I expected to leave a message. Instead, the receptionist returned less than a minute later. "She can see you tomorrow afternoon if that works." I glanced toward the calendar hanging beside my refrigerator. The square for Thursday was empty. That would be wonderful. After hanging up, I stood quietly in my kitchen. The coffee maker continued to drip into the glass pot. Outside, the last of the Christmas snow clung stubbornly to the branches of the maple tree Thomas had planted when Daniel was born. For years, I'd watched that tree grow taller than the house. Thomas used to measure Daniel against it every birthday. One mark for age 6, another for age 7. Eventually, Daniel outgrew the marks. Then the tree outgrew us all. Funny how memories live inside ordinary things. I decided not to tell Daniel about the appointment. Not because I wanted to hide anything. Because I wasn't accusing him of anything. Not yet. Questions deserve answers before they become accusations. That was one of the rules Thomas lived by. And after nearly 45 years of marriage, some of his rules had become mine. The following afternoon, I drove across town beneath a pale gray winter sky. Ellis and Harper occupied a renovated brick building that had once been an old bank. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh coffee. Everything felt calm, professional, quiet. A young receptionist welcomed me with a warm smile. Mrs. Bennett? Attorney Ellis will be right with you. As I waited, my eyes wandered across framed photographs lining the hallway. Graduation pictures, community awards, charity events. Law offices often display accomplishments. Families display memories. Sometimes the two overlap. Sometimes they don't. Margaret Ellis greeted me herself. She appeared to be in her late 50s, with silver beginning to show through dark hair she hadn't bothered to hide. I like that. There was something honest about people who didn't spend all their energy pretending time wasn't passing. She shook my hand firmly. I'm glad you came in. So am I. Her office wasn't extravagant. Bookshelves filled one wall. Family photographs covered another. One picture showed 3 muddy children holding fishing poles beside an old pickup truck. I smiled. My grandchildren always come home looking exactly like that. She laughed. They still do. The simple exchange eased something inside me. After we sat down, she folded her hands across a legal pad. What can I help you with today? I took a slow breath. I think I need to understand something my husband arranged before he passed away. She nodded patiently. Go on. I explained the monthly deposits, the family trust, the Christmas conversation with Daniel. I didn't repeat his exact words. Somehow, saying them aloud made them feel heavier. When I finished, Margaret remained silent for several moments. Not uncomfortable silence. Thoughtful silence. Finally, she asked, have you reviewed the trust documents recently? I honestly don't remember the last time I saw them. She reached toward her computer. I may have copies in the archived file. She typed quietly for nearly a minute. Then she frowned. That's interesting. What is? The trust exists exactly as you described. I felt my shoulders relax slightly. So there isn't a problem? I didn't say that. She turned the monitor slightly toward herself again. I'm simply confirming the trust is active. Her expression remained thoughtful. There are several amendments. I don't remember signing amendments. You may have. I don't think so. She looked back at me. Memory and paperwork don't always agree. I appreciated her honesty. She wasn't trying to reassure me. She was trying to understand. There's a difference. Margaret opened another document. I see the original trust established years ago by you and your husband. That sounded familiar. Then, she paused. Several updates occurred after Mr. Bennett became ill. My stomach tightened slightly. I attended at least one meeting. According to these records, yes. She continued reading. The administrator of the trust also changed. I assumed Daniel handled everything after Thomas passed. Eventually, yes. The word eventually caught my attention. What do you mean? She looked carefully at the screen before answering. It appears there was an interim arrangement before the final transfer of administrative authority. I'm sorry. I don't understand. Neither do I. That surprised me. Lawyers usually seem certain. Margaret didn't. She sounded curious, almost cautious. She leaned back thoughtfully. I'd rather not guess. I appreciate that. I'd like to retrieve the complete archive file before giving you an opinion. How long would that take? Perhaps 2 or 3 business days. I nodded. I've waited this long. She smiled gently. Sometimes that's exactly why we find answers. Before I left, she printed a short summary confirming one important fact. The monthly $5,000 payments were authorized through the trust, not through Daniel's personal income. I looked at the page for several seconds. There it was, in black ink. Simple, clear, undeniable. For years, people had praised my son for supporting his widowed mother. Maybe he had encouraged that belief. Maybe he had simply allowed it. Either way, the paperwork told a different story. As Margaret walked me to the reception area, she spoke almost casually. Mrs. Bennett, yes. When you return, I'd like you to bring any documents you still have from Mr. Collins. I believe I kept everything. I had a feeling you might. Thomas smiled in my memory. Paperweights. He had been right again. Driving home, I didn't feel angry. Not yet. Mostly, I felt disappointed. Disappointment is quieter than anger. It settles slowly, like dust inside an empty room. I stopped at the grocery store for milk and bread. An elderly gentleman held the door open for me. After you, ma'am. Thank you. Small kindnesses have a way of reminding you that decency still exists. Sometimes we simply have to look beyond our own family to find it. That evening, I climbed the stairs to the attic. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old cardboard. Thomas labeled every storage box in thick black marker. Tax records, Christmas decorations, military papers. Then I saw the one I'd been looking for. Estate planning. Dust covered the lid. I carried it downstairs carefully, set it beside the oak desk, and brushed the top clean with my hand. Inside were dozens of neatly organized folders. At the very bottom lay a large sealed envelope. Across the front, in Thomas's unmistakable handwriting, were 7 words that made my heart begin to race. For Martha, if anything ever seems wrong. I didn't open the envelope right away. Instead, I sat there with both hands resting on the worn oak desk. Thomas's handwriting had always been unmistakable. Strong, steady, deliberate. Even after all these years, seeing those familiar letters made it feel as though he had simply stepped into another room and would be back any minute carrying 2 cups of coffee. For Martha, if anything ever seems wrong. He hadn't written if something happens to me. He hadn't written after I'm gone. He had written if anything ever seems wrong. That choice of words settled heavily in my chest. Thomas had rarely worried without reason. He wasn't suspicious by nature. He was careful. There was a difference. I ran my fingers gently across the sealed flap. The envelope had yellowed slightly with age. A thin layer of dust still clung to one corner. Whatever was inside had been waiting patiently for years. Waiting for me. I whispered softly into the empty room. I hope I'm just imagining all of this. The house offered no answer. Only the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Thomas wound that clock every Sunday afternoon. After he passed away, I learned how. It never sounded quite the same, but it kept time. Some things continue because someone chooses not to let them stop. Finally, I opened the envelope. Inside were 3 neatly folded documents. A handwritten letter, a photocopy of several trust papers, and a small yellow sticky note attached to the front. In Thomas's handwriting, it read, "Read the letter first." I smiled despite myself. Even now, he was organizing my thoughts. I unfolded the letter carefully. The paper crackled softly. His handwriting filled both sides of 3 pages. The first line alone brought tears to my eyes. "My dearest Martha, if you're reading this, something has made you uncomfortable enough to start asking questions. If that's true, then I'm glad you trusted your instincts." I paused. He knew me so well. For most of our marriage, I avoided conflict whenever possible. Thomas used to tease me. "You'll give everyone the benefit of the doubt, and you'll question everybody. That's why we work." He wasn't wrong. I continued reading. Thomas explained that during the final year of his illness, managing paperwork had become increasingly difficult. Daniel had offered to help. At first, Thomas welcomed it. After all, Daniel had a sharp business mind. He understood investments far better than either of us ever had. But then Thomas noticed something. Not fraud, not theft, not even dishonesty, just impatience. According to the letter, Daniel had become unusually interested in simplifying everything, consolidating accounts, changing administrators, reducing the number of signatures required for routine decisions. At the time, Thomas assumed our son simply wanted to make life easier. Even so, he asked Attorney Collins to leave copies of every original document exactly as they were. "Paper tells its own story," Thomas wrote. "I wanted there to be a record no one could accidentally rewrite." That sentence lingered with me. I set the letter aside and reached for the photocopied trust documents. Several pages were highlighted in yellow. Most of the legal language was difficult to follow. Trusts have a way of turning ordinary ideas into complicated paragraphs. But one section stood out immediately. Primary beneficiary, Martha Bennett. I nodded. That made sense. Thomas had always insisted I should never have to worry about finances if he passed away first. Further down, another paragraph had also been highlighted. It described the role of the trustee. The trustee could manage investments, approve distributions, handle administrative responsibilities. But the assets themselves remained for the benefit of the beneficiary. I read that paragraph twice. Then a third time. A quiet realization settled over me. Daniel wasn't giving me money. He was managing money that already existed for my benefit. Those were 2 very different things. I leaned back in my chair. Suddenly, dozens of conversations from the past several years returned to me. Friends at church, neighbors, even distant cousins. They all said similar things. "Your son takes wonderful care of you. You're lucky Daniel sends you money every month. He never forgets his responsibilities." I had always smiled politely. Sometimes I even thanked them. Not because I'd said those words myself. Because correcting people had never seemed important. Now I wondered, had Daniel corrected anyone? Or had he simply allowed the story to grow? Reputations are funny things. Sometimes they're built by what people say. Other times, by what they choose not to deny. The handwritten letter continued. Near the end, Thomas wrote something that stopped me completely. If Daniel ever begins treating your financial security as though it depends on his generosity instead of your legal rights, promise me you'll look at the original paperwork before believing anyone's version of the story. I closed my eyes. Christmas Eve returned to me in perfect clarity. Daniel's arm around my shoulders. His confident smile. His whisper. Enjoying the $5,000 a month, Mom? For the first time, I understood why those words had sounded wrong. He hadn't spoken like a son checking on his mother's well-being. He had spoken like someone reminding another person who held the power. Only, the paperwork suggested he didn't. The following morning, I returned to Attorney Margaret Ellis's office carrying the entire estate planning box in the back seat of my car. When she welcomed me inside, I placed Thomas's envelope gently on the conference table. I think my husband wanted me to find this one day. Margaret glanced at the handwriting, but didn't open anything immediately. Instead, she asked quietly, "Have you read it?" "I have." And I took a slow breath. I think Thomas expected questions. She nodded. "Then let's answer them." For nearly an hour, we compared the original trust documents from my box with the archived copies from the law office. Page after page matched perfectly. Dates, signatures, witnesses. Nothing appeared altered. Oddly enough, that didn't comfort me. If anything, it made one question even more important. If the originals are consistent, I asked, why do I feel like I'm missing part of the story? Margaret remained silent for a moment before answering. Because these documents explain how the trust was created. She tapped one finger lightly against the folder. They don't explain every decision made after it became active. I looked at her. What kind of decisions? The trustee keeps records. Every distribution, every authorization, every administrative action. She paused. And those records aren't in this file. A chill ran through me. So where are they? Margaret folded her hands. That's exactly the question I think we need to ask. As I left her office that afternoon, the envelope rested safely inside my purse. For years, I believed the mystery began with a monthly payment. Now I knew better. The money wasn't the mystery. The real story was hidden in the decisions someone had made after my husband was gone. And somewhere, those decisions had been carefully documented. The drive home from Margaret's office felt quieter than usual. Not because the roads were empty. They weren't. Holiday traffic still moved steadily through town as families returned unwanted gifts and children spent Christmas money at crowded stores. Life carried on. It always does. Even when your own world has begun shifting beneath your feet. I kept thinking about one sentence Margaret had repeated before I left. The trustee keeps records. Not opinions. Not memories. Records. Every decision. Every authorization. Every distribution. Somewhere, there was a paper trail that explained what had happened after Thomas was gone. And paper, unlike people, doesn't forget. That evening, I placed Thomas's letter back inside its envelope. I didn't want to read it again. Not because it hurt. Because I understood it now. For years, I believed Thomas left me instructions. He hadn't. He'd left me confidence. Confidence to trust my own judgment if something ever stopped making sense. I looked toward his framed photograph on the bookshelf. It had been taken during our 40th wedding anniversary. He was wearing the navy blazer Emily had given him. His smile was relaxed, patient, steady. The same expression that had carried us through layoffs, illnesses, raising a son, and paying off a mortgage. "I think I'm finally catching up to you," I whispered. The next morning, I called Margaret again. "I've been thinking," I told her. "So have I. I'd like to request those trustee records." "I expected you might. Can I?" "As the primary beneficiary, you have the right to request information about the administration of the trust." The words settled over me slowly. The right. Not a favor. Not permission. A right. Funny how important that distinction becomes. Especially later in life. Margaret suggested we begin with a formal written request. Nothing confrontational. Nothing emotional. Simply a letter asking for copies of the trust's administrative records covering the past several years. "It keeps everything professional," she explained. "And if there's nothing unusual, everyone moves on." I appreciated that. I wasn't looking for a fight. I was looking for clarity. There's a difference. She prepared the request while I waited. 2 pages. Simple language. Straightforward questions. copies of annual accountings, trustee reports, distribution records, administrative expenses, investment summaries. Nothing extraordinary. The kind of documents that should have been easy to provide if everything had been handled properly. Margaret slid the papers across the desk. Read them carefully. I did. Every line. Thomas always read everything before signing. I smiled to myself. Some habits arrive late in life. When I finished, I signed my name. Margaret added hers. We'll send this by certified mail. How long before we hear something? Usually not long. And if they refuse? She paused. Let's not assume they will. She always answered questions without adding unnecessary drama. I admired that. Real confidence doesn't need loud words. 3 days passed. Then 4. Life returned to its ordinary rhythm. I attended church committee meetings. Volunteered at the public library one afternoon. Watered the houseplants. Folded laundry. Cooked enough vegetable soup to last the week. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, I noticed myself becoming more observant. Not suspicious. Simply attentive. It's remarkable what you begin noticing once you stop assuming everything is fine. On Friday afternoon, my phone rang. Daniel. I hesitated only a second before answering. Hi, sweetheart. Hi, Mom. His voice sounded cheerful, comfortable, exactly as always. How have you been? Oh, keeping busy. You settling back in after Christmas? I am. There was a brief pause. Then he asked, everything okay? The question sounded casual, yet something about its timing caught my attention. Why do you ask? No reason. I just haven't talked to you in a few days. That was true. Still, mothers learn to hear the spaces between words. We chatted another 5 minutes. The grandchildren were back in school. Emily was planning a charity fundraiser. His company had landed another large client. Ordinary conversation. Before hanging up, he added, let me know if you need anything. I always will. I mean it. I know. After we said goodbye, I set my phone on the kitchen counter. For years, that conversation would have reassured me. This time, it raised another question. Had he called because he missed me? Or because someone had already told him about the certified letter? Monday morning brought the answer. Margaret called before lunch. We received a response. Already? Yes. Good. I'd rather show it to you in person. Her tone remained calm, professional, but I had begun recognizing something else. Whenever she became especially careful with her words, it usually meant she had found something worth paying attention to. An hour later, I sat across from her conference table again. A single envelope rested between us. Margaret removed one sheet of paper and handed it to me. It wasn't the records we'd requested. It was a letter from another law firm. I read slowly. The trustee acknowledged receiving my request, then politely declined to release the documents. According to the letter, the records were considered confidential administrative material and not necessary for my continued benefit under the trust. I looked up. I don't understand. You should. I thought beneficiaries could request information. They generally can. So why refuse? Margaret folded her hands. That's exactly why this response concerns me. She pointed gently toward one paragraph. The wording is very careful. I read it again. The trustee has determined additional disclosure is unnecessary at this time. Unnecessary. Not unavailable. Not non-existent. Unnecessary. A single word. But words matter, especially inside legal documents. Margaret remained quiet while I finished reading. Finally, I asked, what happens now? There are several options. I don't want a lawsuit. I'm not suggesting one. She offered a reassuring smile. Sometimes all we need is the right question directed to the right person. And who would that be? She opened a yellow legal pad she'd been writing on. The individual currently serving as trustee. I already knew the answer before she spoke the name. Still, hearing it aloud felt different. Margaret looked directly at me. Martha, the current trustee is your son, Daniel. The room fell silent. Not because I was shocked. Some part of me had expected it. But expectation and confirmation are two different things. One lives in your imagination. The other becomes impossible to ignore. As I stared at Daniel's name printed on the page before me, I realized the next conversation wouldn't be between a beneficiary and a trustee. It would be between a mother and the son she'd trusted all her life. Daniel. Even after Margaret said his name aloud, I found myself staring at the paper as though another answer might suddenly appear. It didn't. His name remained there. Clear. Ordinary. Permanent. For several moments, Neither of us spoke. Finally, I folded the letter carefully and slid it back across the table. I don't want to believe my son is hiding something. Margaret nodded. You don't have to. I don't. No. She leaned back slightly. You only need to acknowledge that he's chosen not to share information you have a legal right to request. There was no accusation in her voice, only precision. Thomas had always appreciated people who spoke that way. Facts first, feelings later. As I left her office, the January air felt colder than it had all week. I sat inside my car for several minutes without starting the engine. The steering wheel felt icy beneath my hands. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Mostly, I was grieving something I couldn't quite name. When children are young, parents spend years teaching them the difference between right and wrong. You imagine those lessons stay with them forever. You never imagine reaching 70 years old and wondering whether your own child remembers them. I drove home by way of the old neighborhood instead of taking the highway. Sometimes familiar streets help untangle unfamiliar thoughts. The little brick house where Daniel had learned to ride his bicycle still stood on the corner. Mrs. Turner's white fence had finally been replaced. The bakery where Thomas used to buy cinnamon rolls every Saturday morning was now a coffee shop. Time changes neighborhoods quietly. Families, too. You simply notice it more when memories are attached to every corner. That evening, I took out an old photo album. Not because I was searching for evidence. Because I needed to remind myself that before Daniel became a successful businessman, he had been my little boy. There he was at 6 years old, missing his 2 front teeth, holding a fishing pole almost taller than he was. Another picture showed him at 12, proudly carrying the blue ribbon he'd won at the county science fair. Thomas stood beside him with one hand resting gently on his shoulder. Neither of us cared whether Daniel became wealthy. We cared whether he became kind. At least, we tried to teach him that. My phone buzzed just after dinner. Emily. Hi, Martha. Hello, dear. I hope we're not interrupting your evening. Not at all. She sounded cheerful. We're putting together the guest list for our charity gala next month. Oh, Daniel thought you'd enjoy coming. I smiled politely, even though she couldn't see me. That sounds lovely. We're honoring several local families who support community programs. I'm sure it'll be beautiful. It always is. There was a brief pause before she added. Daniel also mentioned he hasn't seen you much since Christmas. I've simply been keeping busy. I'll tell him that. Her voice remained warm. Natural. Nothing about the conversation suggested she knew anything about lawyers or trust documents. If Daniel had told her, she certainly didn't show it. After we hung up, I carried my tea into the living room. Snow had begun falling again. Large flakes drifted slowly beneath the porch light. Thomas loved watching snowstorms. They remind people to slow down. Perhaps that's why winter has never frightened me. It forces patience. You can't rush a snowfall. You simply let it happen. I decided I would treat this the same way. No emotional phone calls. No accusations. No dramatic confrontations. If the truth existed, it would still exist tomorrow. 2 mornings later, Margaret called again. I've been reviewing older correspondence. Did you find something? Possibly. Her voice remained measured. I'd like you to come by this afternoon. When I arrived, several folders were already spread across her conference table. She pointed toward a stack of annual trust summaries. These are routine reports. They don't contain every transaction, but they do tell us something. I sat beside her. What am I looking for? Read the cover letters. The first letter was dated nearly 5 years earlier. It acknowledged that the annual trust report had been prepared and delivered to the trustee. Nothing unusual. The second year looked similar. So did the third. Then I noticed something. Each letter listed only one recipient. The trustee, Daniel. I looked up. I never received these. No. You should have. Margaret chose her words carefully. Best practice is for beneficiaries to remain reasonably informed about trust administration. Reasonably informed. I like those words better. So do I. She slid another document toward me. This is what concerns me. It wasn't a financial statement. It was a communication log. A simple record showing when information had been requested. And by whom. For years, there had been almost no questions. No requests. No discussions. Everything flowed in one direction. Toward Daniel. Away from me. I frowned. I trusted him. I know. I never thought to ask. Most parents wouldn't. Her answer surprised me. You've seen situations like this before? I've seen families where one person gradually begins handling everything. Sometimes it works beautifully. And sometimes, She let the sentence trail away. I finished it myself. The rest of the family slowly stops asking questions. She gave a quiet nod. Exactly. Not because anyone intended harm. Because convenience slowly became habit. And habit eventually looked like authority. On my way home, I stopped at the cemetery. I hadn't planned to. Some days simply lead you where you need to go. Thomas's headstone stood beneath a blanket of fresh snow. I brushed away enough to read his name. "You're still giving me advice?" I said softly. "I just wish I could ask one more question." The wind moved gently through the bare trees. No answer came. None was needed. Thomas had already left me everything he could. Not money. Not instructions. Perspective. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to surprise Daniel. I wasn't going to trap him. Before lawyers sent another letter, before assumptions hardened into conclusions, I wanted to give my son an opportunity to explain. Not as a trustee, not as a businessman, simply as my son. So I picked up my phone and sent a short message. "Would you have lunch with me this Friday? Just the two of us. I'd enjoy some time together." His reply came less than 2 minutes later. "Of course, Mom. I'd love that." I stared at those words for a long time. Perhaps everything still had an innocent explanation. Perhaps Friday would put my worries to rest. Or perhaps, for the first time since Christmas Eve, my son and I would sit across from one another with something far more important than lunch waiting between us. Friday arrived colder than the weather forecast had promised. A thin layer of frost covered my windshield as I backed out of the driveway. The sky hung low and gray, threatening more snow before evening. I had chosen the restaurant carefully. Not one of Daniel's favorite steakhouses where half the city seemed to recognize him. Not the country club. Just a small family-owned diner on the edge of town where Thomas and I had eaten breakfast nearly every Saturday for more than 20 years. The booths had been reupholstered since then. The coffee was still excellent. Some places survive because they never try too hard to become something else. Families could learn from that. I arrived 15 minutes early. Old habit. Thomas hated keeping people waiting. Even now, I found myself straightening the sugar packets on the table while I waited. The waitress smiled as she poured coffee. "You meeting someone?" "My son." "That's nice." "Yes." At least, I hoped it still was. Daniel walked in exactly on time. Dark wool coat. Leather briefcase. The same confident stride I'd seen him develop over the past decade. He spotted me immediately and smiled. "Mom." He leaned down and kissed my cheek. "You look wonderful." "So do you." And he did. There were faint lines around his eyes now. A little gray beginning to appear at his temples. For a brief moment, I saw not the businessman everyone admired, but the little boy who used to beg for extra pancakes after church. It made what I needed to ask even harder. We ordered lunch. Nothing fancy. Turkey sandwiches. Soup. Coffee. For the first 15 minutes, we spoke about ordinary things. The grandchildren. Emily's charity gala. The unusually cold winter. His newest business project. He looked relaxed. Comfortable. If he was worried about my meeting with Margaret, he hid it well. Then again, Daniel had always been good at hiding nerves. When he played high school baseball, he looked calm even before championship games. Only afterward would he admit his hands had been shaking inside his gloves. As the waitress cleared our plates, I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup. "Daniel." He looked up. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "It's about the family trust." His expression changed so slightly that another person might never have noticed. His smile remained, but it no longer reached his eyes. "What about it?" "I've been organizing paperwork." "Makes sense. I came across some documents your father left." He nodded once. "Dad always kept everything." He certainly did. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Finally, I asked, "Can you help me understand how the trust is being managed?" He leaned back in the booth. "I thought everything was already clear. I realize there are things I don't understand." "Like what?" "The monthly distributions. They're automatic." "I know." "The reports. They're routine." "I know." "The trustee records." For the first time all afternoon, Daniel looked away, only briefly, toward the window, then back at me. "What trustee records?" "The administrative records." His fingers tapped softly against the coffee mug, a habit he inherited from Thomas whenever he needed time to think. "You've been talking to a lawyer." It wasn't a question. I answered honestly. "Yes." He sighed. "I wish you'd come to me first." "I am coming to you." "No." He offered a polite smile. "You went to an attorney first." His words weren't angry, but they carried disappointment. I understood why. At least partly. I wasn't accusing you. It feels that way. I was trying to understand. You could have asked. I am asking now. The conversation settled into silence again. Neither of us raised our voices. Neither of us wanted a scene. Around us, families laughed over lunch. Coffee cups clinked. A little girl in the next booth proudly showed her grandmother a drawing she'd made with crayons. Life continued around our table, unaware that ours had become the quietest conversation in the room. Daniel folded his hands together. The trust is complicated. I've gathered that. There are tax issues. I understand. Investment decisions. I understand. It's easier if one person handles everything. I nodded slowly. I can see that. He looked relieved. Then I asked the one question I couldn't stop carrying. If everything has been handled properly, why was I told I couldn't see the records? His shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. Who told you that? The attorney representing the trust. He exhaled slowly. They're just protecting the process. From me? No. Then from whom? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for his coffee, only to discover it had gone cold. He set the cup back down untouched. Mom. His voice softened. You've trusted me all these years. I have. And have I ever failed to make sure you're taken care of? I thought carefully before answering. You've made sure my bills were paid. Exactly. But that wasn't my question. He rubbed one hand across his forehead. I don't understand why this suddenly matters. I looked at him for a long moment. It matters because you whispered something to me at Christmas. His eyes met mine. Neither of us looked away. You remember. Every word. I didn't mean anything by it. Then what did you mean? He opened his mouth, closed it again. Finally, he smiled faintly. It was a bad joke. No. The word left my mouth more gently than I expected. It wasn't. His smile disappeared. I know you, Daniel. I know when you're joking. I also know when you're reminding someone of something. The silence between us became heavier than anything either of us had actually said. After several long moments, Daniel reached into his briefcase. I wasn't planning to do this today. He removed a thick, sealed envelope. My name was written neatly across the front. Martha Bennett. He rested it on the table without sliding it toward me. I've had this prepared for a while. What is it? Information. What kind of information? The trust. I looked from the envelope to my son's face. If you already had this, why didn't you give it to me before? His answer came almost as a whisper. Because I was waiting until I thought you were ready. Something about those words unsettled me even more than the envelope itself. Ready? Ready for what? I didn't reach for it. Neither did he. The envelope remained between us like a third person sitting at our table. For the first time since this journey had begun, I realized the truth might not be hidden inside forgotten paperwork. It might already be sitting in front of me, still sealed, waiting for one final decision before everything changed. Daniel left the envelope on the table between us. For several long seconds, neither of us reached for it. The waitress came by with the check, smiled politely, and asked if we needed anything else. No, thank you, I answered. She walked away without realizing she had interrupted one of the most important conversations of my life. Daniel finally slid the envelope toward me. I think you should read it. I rested my hand on top of it. The paper felt heavier than it should have, not because of what was inside, because of what it represented. For weeks, I had been searching for answers. Now they sat only inches away. Yet something inside me said, not here. I slipped the envelope into my handbag. I'll read it at home. Daniel looked almost relieved. I think that's best. We stood. He hugged me before we left the diner. It was the same embrace he had given me on Christmas Eve. Warm, confident, almost reassuring. But this time, there was no whisper. Only silence. The drive home felt longer than usual. The envelope rested on the passenger seat beside my purse. More than once, I considered pulling into an empty parking lot to open it. Instead, I kept driving. Thomas used to say, never read important papers when your emotions are louder than your thoughts. He believed decisions deserved a clear mind. I intended to honor that. Back home, I hung my coat, made a fresh pot of coffee, and carried everything into the den. The afternoon light filtered softly through the window, overlooking the backyard. Winter had stripped every tree bare. Nothing hid behind leaves anymore. Perhaps that was fitting. Some seasons are meant for revealing. I placed 3 things on the oak desk. Thomas's handwritten letter, the trust documents Margaret had copied, Daniel's sealed envelope. 3 pieces of the same story, separated by years, connected by one family. Before opening Daniel's envelope, I read Thomas's letter again. Not every word, only the final page. One paragraph caught my attention immediately. If you ever feel pressured to accept someone's explanation simply because you love them, remember that truth never asks to be protected. It only asks to be examined. I read the sentence twice. Then I carefully folded the letter and placed it beside me. Only then did I open Daniel's envelope. Inside were neatly organized documents. No dramatic confession. No handwritten apology. Just paperwork. The first page summarized the trust's current value. The second listed annual investment returns. Another outlined distributions made over the previous 5 years. Everything appeared orderly, professional, transparent. At first glance, I almost laughed at myself. Perhaps I really had misunderstood everything. Then I noticed something. Several pages were missing page numbers. One report jumped from page 6 to page 9. Another skipped an attachment entirely. At the bottom of one statement appeared a small notation. Supporting schedules available upon request. Available, yet never included. It wasn't proof of wrongdoing. It wasn't even evidence of dishonesty. It was simply incomplete. Once again, I spent nearly 3 hours comparing every document against the copies Margaret had shown me. Yellow sticky notes slowly appeared across the desk. Distribution dates matched. Investment summaries matched. Trust balances generally matched. But administrative notes did not. Some referenced meetings I had never attended. Others mentioned approvals without identifying who had approved them. Every answer seemed to produce another question. Thomas had been right. Paper tells stories. Sometimes by what it includes. Sometimes by what it quietly leaves out. The next morning, I carried the folder into Margaret's office. She greeted me with the same calm smile. You opened it. I did. And I think Daniel wanted to reassure me. She studied my expression. But I don't think he realized reassurance isn't the same thing as transparency. She nodded slowly. May I? I handed her the documents. She read carefully. Lawyers have a different relationship with paper than most people. They don't simply read. They observe. Every signature. Every date. Every missing attachment. Every unexplained reference. Nearly 20 minutes passed before she spoke. These documents aren't false. I didn't think they were. They're also not complete. I felt an unexpected sense of relief. Not because something was wrong. Because my instincts hadn't been imagining things. Margaret pointed to one paragraph. This references trustee meeting minutes. I noticed. They're missing. She turned another page. This refers to written recommendations. Also missing. Another page. Here. She tapped gently. Supporting schedules. I saw that. They matter. Why? Because summaries tell you conclusions. She looked directly at me. Supporting documents tell you how those conclusions were reached. That made perfect sense. Thomas never showed Daniel only the total when helping him with math homework. He showed every step. The answer mattered. The process mattered more. Margaret closed the folder. I think your son believes these documents answer your questions. They don't. No. They answer the questions he expected you to ask. The room became very quiet. I understood exactly what she meant. Daniel had offered information, just not all of it, whether intentionally or simply because he believed the details were unimportant. I still didn't know, and I refused to guess. Before I left, Margaret asked one unexpected question. When was the last time your entire family sat together without a holiday or special occasion? I thought for a moment. I honestly can't remember. What if you invited them? For dinner? She smiled. No lawyers. No accusations. No surprises. Just family. I frowned slightly. I don't understand. Sometimes people explain themselves differently around a conference table than around a dining table. I thought about that all the way home. 3 days later, I mailed handwritten invitations. Not formal ones. Just simple notes. Sunday dinner. Family only. Emily. Daniel. Lily. Noah. No business partners. No neighbors. No holiday crowd. Just us. Emily called that evening. This is a lovely surprise. I've missed everyone. So have the kids. Daniel texted only one sentence. We'll be there, Mom. Nothing more. Nothing less. Sunday afternoon arrived bright and unusually warm for January. For the first time in years, my little dining room looked the way it once had. The good china. Thomas's carved wooden serving bowl. The blue linen tablecloth we bought on our 25th anniversary. I roasted a chicken. Mashed potatoes. Green beans with almonds. Apple pie. Not because I wanted to impress anyone. Because home-cooked meals remind people where they came from. Before the doorbell rang, I carried one final item into the dining room. A plain leather folder. Inside were Thomas's letter, the original trust documents, Daniel's packet, and a neat list of questions written in my own handwriting. No accusations, only questions. I placed the folder at the end of the table beside my seat. Then I heard my grandchildren laughing on the front porch. The doorbell rang. I took one slow breath. Tonight wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about giving my family one last opportunity to choose honesty before the truth spoke for itself. The door opened before I had a chance to reach it. Grandma. Lily threw her arms around me first. Noah wasn't far behind, carrying a board game under one arm. I brought the one Grandpa used to beat Dad at. I laughed. So you remember that? He always let me win, Noah said proudly. I smiled but didn't correct him. Thomas had never let anyone win. He simply taught people how to lose with dignity. That was different. Daniel walked in carrying a bottle of sparkling cider. Emily followed with a bowl of salad she'd prepared herself. Everything looked normal, exactly the way families are supposed to look on a Sunday afternoon. Coats hung by the front door. Children chased each other through the hallway. Emily complimented the smell of the roasted chicken. Daniel asked whether I'd managed to keep warm through the recent cold spell. If someone had looked through the window, they would have seen nothing but an ordinary family gathering. Sometimes, ordinary moments carry extraordinary weight. Dinner began peacefully. We talked about school, about Noah's basketball season, about Lily's piano recital. Emily shared stories about the charity gala she was organizing. Daniel mentioned a new community scholarship his company planned to sponsor. I listened more than I spoke. Not because I had nothing to say, because I wanted to remember this version of my family. The version before difficult questions entered the room. After dessert, I stood to refill the coffee cups. When I returned to the table, I carried the leather folder with me. No one noticed it at first. I placed it gently beside my plate. Then I looked around the table. I've been thinking about your father. Daniel smiled. I think about him all the time. I know. I found one of his letters. Emily looked up. A letter? He left it with our estate papers. Daniel's expression became more serious. I didn't know that. I don't think anyone did. I rested my hand on the folder. He asked me to trust facts before assumptions. No one interrupted. I opened the folder. Not dramatically. Not like someone presenting evidence in a courtroom. Simply, the way Thomas would have opened a family photo album. One page at a time. I've spent the past few weeks organizing our financial records. Daniel remained calm. I figured you might. I also met with attorney Margaret Ellis. Emily glanced briefly toward Daniel. It lasted less than a second. But I noticed. Age teaches you to notice small things. I've learned something important. I looked directly at my son. The monthly $5,000 payments don't come from your personal income. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Finally, he nodded. That's correct. Emily looked surprised. I thought. She stopped herself. Daniel finished the sentence for her. Most people assumed they did. His honesty caught me off guard. So you knew people believed that? I knew. And you never corrected them. He lowered his eyes for a moment. No. The room became very quiet. I wasn't interested in embarrassing him. That had never been my goal. I want to understand why. Daniel took a slow breath. It was easier. Easier for whom? For everyone. He folded his hands together. People expect successful children to support their parents. I didn't see any reason to explain the trust every time someone mentioned it. Emily looked between us. You never told me that. I thought I had. No. She shook her head gently. I honestly believed you were sending your mother your own money. Daniel looked genuinely surprised. I never realized you thought that. No one spoke for several seconds. Sometimes misunderstandings grow because nobody asks one more question. I slid another document across the table. This isn't what concerns me. Daniel looked at it. What does? The records I requested. He sighed quietly. I was hoping we wouldn't discuss that today. I wasn't. I invited you because you're my family. But since we're here, I smiled sadly. I'd rather ask you than let strangers guess. Daniel leaned back in his chair. I didn't refuse because I wanted to hide something. Then why? Because those records involve investment strategies, tax planning, private business information. I was trying to protect the trust. I listened carefully. His explanation sounded reasonable. Almost. Then I remembered something Margaret had said. Summaries tell you conclusions. Supporting documents tell you how those conclusions were reached. So let me ask differently. I kept my voice calm. Have you ever used trust assets for anything that wasn't permitted? His answer came immediately. No. Have you ever taken money that belonged to me? No. Have you ever changed the trust against Dad's wishes? Another pause. This one lasted longer. Finally, no. The answer was still no, but it arrived more slowly. I noticed. So did Emily. She looked at her husband with quiet confusion. Daniel, what? Why didn't you just give your mom everything she asked for? He rubbed both hands together. Because I thought she'd misunderstand. Emily frowned. She's asking questions, not accusing you. I know. Then why are you acting like she is? Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he stared at the folder resting between us. For the first time all evening, the confident businessman disappeared. In his place sat a tired son who suddenly looked much younger than his 50 years. He reached into his jacket pocket. I brought something. He removed a small flash drive. I wasn't sure whether to give this to you. I looked at it. What is it? Digital copies. Of everything. Emily blinked. Everything. Daniel nodded slowly. The trustee reports. The meeting minutes. The investment records. The supporting schedules. Every document Margaret had asked for. He set the flash drive beside my coffee cup. I should have done this weeks ago. I didn't reach for it. Neither did anyone else. Because one question still remained. If he already had every record, why had he refused to release them when my attorney requested them? And as Daniel looked down at the table, I realized his next answer would determine whether this story ended as a misunderstanding or as a betrayal. No one reached for the flash drive. Not me. Not Daniel. Not even Emily. It rested quietly on the table, no larger than a stick of chewing gum. Strange, isn't it? How something so small can carry the weight of an entire family. Outside, the afternoon sun had begun to fade behind the maple trees. Inside, the only sound came from Lily and Noah laughing in the living room as they argued over the board game. Children have a remarkable gift. They continue believing the world is safe while adults quietly decide what kind of world it will become. Daniel finally broke the silence. I made a mistake. He didn't rush the words. He didn't defend himself. He simply let them exist. I thought if I handled everything, life would be easier. I looked at him without speaking. When Dad got sick, everything happened so fast. There were doctors, business, legal meetings. You trusted me. I wanted to prove I deserved that trust. Emily reached for his hand. He held hers for only a moment before continuing. The trust performed well. The investments grew. I never took money that wasn't allowed. I never changed who the beneficiary was. I never intended to hurt you. He stopped and looked directly into my eyes. But somewhere along the way, I started believing I was protecting everything, when really, I was controlling everything. Those last 3 words settled over the room with a quiet honesty I hadn't expected. I thought about Christmas Eve, the whisper, the $5,000. For weeks I had replayed that moment over and over. Finally I asked, why did you say it? Daniel lowered his eyes. I wish I hadn't. But why? He sighed. One of my business partners made a comment earlier that night. What kind of comment? He joked that supporting aging parents was expensive. I laughed. I shouldn't have. When I hugged you, I repeated the joke. He shook his head slowly. It sounded harmless in my mind. But the moment I said it, I knew it wasn't. You looked at me differently. And instead of apologizing, I hoped you'd forget. I believed him. Not because he was my son. Because regret has a look you cannot rehearse. Emily spoke next. Her voice trembled. I owe you an apology too. I turned toward her. I never asked enough questions. I assumed Daniel had explained everything. I assumed you knew everything. I shouldn't have assumed. She smiled sadly. I've organized charity events for families for years. I tell people communication matters. And somehow, I forgot to practice it in my own home. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. We all forget things. The important part is remembering before it's too late. The grandchildren wandered back into the dining room. Are we ready for pie? Noah asked hopefully. Daniel laughed for the first time all afternoon. I think that's the smartest thing anyone has said today. The tension softened. Not disappeared. Softened. There is a difference. Healing rarely arrives all at once. It arrives in small moments. A shared smile. A familiar laugh. Someone choosing to stay instead of walking away. Later that evening, after the children had gone upstairs to look through old photo albums, Daniel and I returned to the dining table. Only the two of us. The flash drive still sat where he'd placed it. He pushed it toward me. It belongs to you. I looked at it, then gently pushed it back. No. He frowned slightly. I don't understand. I'd rather Margaret review everything first. He nodded immediately. That's fair. I'll authorize full access. No conditions. No delays. No lawyers arguing over wording. Everything. He smiled faintly. Dad would have insisted on that. Yes. He would have. Over the following weeks, Margaret reviewed every document, every report, every investment record. He exercised far too much discretion without transparency. She paused. Poor judgment. Not fraud. Those two words mattered. Poor judgment. Not fraud. One required accountability. The other would have destroyed a family forever. At Margaret's recommendation, the trust was amended. A professional co-trustee was appointed alongside Daniel. Annual reports would now come directly to me. Every major decision required independent documentation. No more assumptions. No more whispered reminders. Only openness. Oddly enough, Daniel agreed to every change without argument. I don't want Mom to wonder anymore, he said. I want her to know. That sentence meant more to me than any legal document. The following Christmas looked very different. Not because the house had changed, because we had. This time, dinner was at my home. The same little dining room. The same oak table. The same apple pie. No caterers. No crystal chandeliers. No business conversations. Just family. Real family. Lily burned the dinner rolls. Noah spilled cider on the tablecloth. Emily laughed so hard she nearly dropped the mashed potatoes. Daniel stood beside me in the kitchen while I sliced pie. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I know. No. I mean it. I looked at my son. The successful executive was still there. But so was the little boy who once believed his mother could fix anything. I forgive you. His shoulders relaxed. But forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. I understand. And trust. It grows the same way it did the first time. One honest choice at a time. He nodded. I'll earn it. I hope you do. As I write this today, I'm no longer afraid of difficult conversations. Growing older has taught me something I wish I'd understood decades ago. Love should never require silence. Respect should never depend on confusion. And the people who truly care about you will never ask you to remain in the dark just so they can feel in control. My husband once wrote that truth never asks to be protected, only examined. He was right. Truth didn't destroy my family. Secrets almost did. If my story has taught you anything, I hope it's this. Never confuse gratitude with surrender. Ask questions with kindness. Answer them with honesty. Because money can build beautiful houses, but only truth can build a home.